The second of President Bush's 4 press secretaries has now thrown his old boss under the bus. Breaking news tonight in our 4th story, Politico.com has this evening revealed excerpts from Scott McClellan's new book, in which Mr. McClellan accuses Mr. Bush of not being open and forthright on Iraq, of having used propaganda to sell the war, in which he insists while he was defending Karl Rove and Scooter Libby against reports that they had a hand in the outing of Valerie Plame, they were holding a secret West Wing meeting to get their Plame stories straight, and that they had at best misled McClellan about their roles. McClellan's book, entitled What Happened Inside the Bush White House and Washington's Culture of Deception, is not to be officially published until Monday, was embargoed until then, except, as is now par for the course, copies were apparently on sale in at least one Washington bookstore over the holiday weekend. A few other highlights. The president took a, quote, permanent campaign approach to governing instead of turning to candor or competence. That McClellan's own statements as press secretary, he said, were badly misguided. That after Hurricane Katrina, the White House, quote, spent most of the first week in a state of denial, and that Karl Rove dreamt up the disastrous flyover photo of Bush in midair above New Orleans. Karl was convinced we needed to do it, and the president agreed. One of the worst disasters in our nation's history, he writes, became one of the biggest disasters in Bush's presidency. Katrina and the botched federal response to it would largely come to define Bush's second term, and the perception of this catastrophe was made worse by previous decisions President Bush had made, including first and foremost the failure to be open and forthright on Iraq and rushing to war with inadequate planning and preparation for its aftermath. Let's bring in MSNBC political analyst Rachel Maddow, also host of her own show weeknights on Air America Radio. Rachel, good evening.
Hi, Keith.
Boy, that sounds like either you or me. I'm not sure which it sounds more like.
This is a surprise, yeah.
To say the least. Let me read you a few more of these quotes and get your reaction. The collapse of the administration's rationales for war, which became apparent months after our invasion, should never have come as such a surprise. In this case, the liberal media didn't live up to its reputation. If it had, the country would have been better served. And the timing of this is, as the White House has now taken on the NBC and the New York Times on this phony bull cry of liberal media. And Scott McClellan is saying, if it's a choice between President Bush and the liberal media, believe the liberal media.
Exactly. And it is one thing to hear that argument from the liberals of America who have long lusted after the form of the caricature they see from the right of a liberal media, have long hoped for something like that. It is totally another thing to hear it from the guy who was paid to not tell the American people the truth about the Iraq war when it was happening. It is really surprising to hear this coming from a Bush loyalist, a former White House spokesman, and a person who is writing this book while Bush is still in office and not after. I did not see this coming.
I mean, we heard hints about this, if you'll recall, a few months ago about what he would be saying, and then it was sort of retracted. It was just the publisher hyping it, and yet it comes out with things like this quote. He and his advisors, obviously the president, confused the propaganda campaign with the high level of candor and honesty so fundamentally needed to build and then sustain public support during a time of war. In this regard, he was terribly ill-served by his top advisors, especially those involved directly in national security. Again, I don't know if that sounds more like you or me.
Right. It is to hear the press secretary decrying the lack of candor and honesty.
About national security.
About national security, about the most serious issues that he would be called to discuss from that podium. But also, you do see a little bit of what we expect. You do see a little of the old Scott McClellan in that conclusion, and a little more in what he says about the Scooter Libby liability issue. And that is that the president was ill-served by his advisors. That the president had advisors who didn't tell him to do the right thing. As if no indication of how to do the right thing could ever come from the president himself. And as if his responsibility to do the right thing doesn't extend to choosing the right advisors.
On the other hand, though, to assign any of this responsibility to George Bush from somebody who worked, and it sounds like 50% or more is being assigned to the president directly by McClellan for somebody who worked for him. There's been nothing like this since Paul O'Neill went out, and people just sort of, he was kind of crazy, you know. They can't say this about McClellan. McClellan was the public voice, and they're very sorry to see him go.
Right. We have seen a lot of self-exonerating books from former members of the Bush administration. It has been since Paul O'Neill. I mean, there was David Quo's book, Paul O'Neill, Richard Clark, Paul Bremer, Colin Powell, George Tenet, the White House chef, wrote a self-exonerating book about the Bush administration. A lot of people have left the administration and then written books about saving their own skins. Very few of them have left the administration and turned around and say, j'accuse. But that really is what McClellan's doing.
And to be fair to Clark, who'll be on this program later on, he got out very early and not entirely of his own choosing.
He got out sounding the alarm about what he had left behind.
All right, but back to McClellan. He did, as you said, exonerate Bush to some degree on the outing flame. Let me read this. It's kind of long. I had allowed myself to be deceived into unknowingly passing along a falsehood, McClellan writes. It would ultimately prove fatal to my ability to serve the president effectively. I didn't learn that what I'd said was untrue until the media began to figure it out almost 2 years later. So far, so good. Neither, I believe, did President Bush. He, too, had been deceived and therefore became unwittingly involved in deceiving me. But the top White House officials who knew the truth, including Rove, Libby, and possibly Vice President Cheney, allowed me, even encouraged me, to repeat a lie. We might have qualms about whether or not Bush was involved in that particular lie and what nature his involvement existed, but he personally fingers Rove, Libby, and Cheney.
At the time that
Yes.
federal investigators were looking into this as a criminal matter. I mean, Scooter Libby was done for lying to investigators and obstructing justice. If you're talking about witnesses colluding to line up their statements with one another during the process of a federal criminal investigation, this is not just, I think you're a bad guy.
Yeah.
This is, I think you ought to be in the Crowbar Hotel. This is, I mean, he's making allegations here that if they held up presumably would have criminal implications.
I wonder if he could have provided more material information. We will get to ask him that next week, a point I'll bring up in a moment. Our own Rachel Maddow, the host of The Rachel Maddow Show on Air America. Thanks as always for coming in.
Thanks.